Well, good. I'm going to jump in and get us started. You ready, Bhavin?
Yep, ready to go.
Great. Well, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We're very excited to share with you all some valuable information around a topic that has garnered a lot of recent interest, artificial intelligence, or commonly known as AI, and ISO 42001, the organization's recently released standard. But before we jump in here, I do have a few housekeeping items. So in a minute, I'll let Bhavin introduce himself and take you through today's content. But if you have any questions along the way, please use the Q&A box in your Zoom window to submit them. Our wonderful webinar master, Emma Cardy, will be monitoring the questions, and we will try to address them at the end of today's session. Second, please keep an eye on your screen. We have a few quick poll questions that will pop up for you to answer throughout today's presentation. This is a great opportunity for you to share your experience from within your organization and to learn from each other's experiences. So we'll notify you when those questions are up. Please take a minute to participate. And with that, Bhavin, please take it away.
Awesome. Thanks, Kirsty. Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar. In today's webinar, we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence and ISO 42001. As you guys have probably heard, artificial intelligence is in the news everywhere today, right? People are using ChatGPT to create and do work nowadays. People are using Sora to create fake videos, etc. Well, as we adopt this new technologies and tools, there's a lot of risk that is associated with it, right? So ISO came out with the standard 42001 to kind of help adopt and implement practices to mitigate against some of these risks. So today we're going to be diving into what is ISO 42001 and some of the intricacies behind it. Here's a list of today's agenda item. We're going to start off with quick introductions. Then we're going to dive into what is ISO, kind of giving you a quick overview of ISO and its standards. Then we're going to dive into specifically 42001 standard itself. What is our use cases? Who is responsible for using it or who should be using it? What are some of the key aspects of applicability? Does it apply to your company or does it apply to an XYZ organization? We'll kind of talk about that. Then we'll talk about the structure a little bit. So what is the structure of the standard itself? And then we'll dive into some of the core components of it. And then finally, we'll be kind of talking about some of the regulations and guidance that are mandating artificial intelligence uses, and then also how that's impacted by the new artificial intelligence 42001 standard. And then for organizations that do seek to get certified in ISO 42001, we'll kind of give you an overview of some of the processes for becoming 42001 compliant, and then the timeline associated with that. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session, as Christy had mentioned, so save all of your questions for the Q&A sessions. That being said, today's presenter is myself, Bhavin Patel. I'm a manager here at Tevora. I oversee the ISO practice. I have a bachelor's from Georgia State University with an accounting degree and a computer information systems, and I have various lead auditor certifications for ISO, along with my CISA, High Trust, and AWS Solutions Architect certifications. Before we kind of get started, let's do a poll question. Has your organizations heard or discussed a plan for ISO 42001? There should be a poll popping up on your screen right now. Take a few more moments to answer the poll question. We'll give everyone a few more.
Perfect. Last call for responses, and I'll share the results here.
Awesome. Looks like the poll survey comes back and it says most of the people have heard of it or is on their radar, which is a good thing, right? For those of you that don't know about it or haven't heard of it, we're going to be going into some of the intricate details of it today. So, every detail will be a good starting point, right? So what is ISO and why does it matter, right? So for some of you, you are familiar with ISO. Well, it stands for International Organization for Standardization. It's an independent organization, not related to any government entity, et cetera. They provide a bunch of different standards. So these standards are used by organizations like yourself to implement policies and procedures and controls. And those policies and procedures and controls help to ensure that you're delivering a safe product and you're delivering a safe service, right? So if your entity is offering a product and you want to show that you have good quality and safety of it, then you would pursue one of these various standards that ISO offers. There's a bunch of different standards out there. 42001 is for artificial intelligence. The other more common one is 27001, which is for information security. So for example, if company A wants to do business with company B, then they say, hey, how are you protecting my data? Well, to avoid that question altogether, you can get your ISO 27001 certification and then show them that certificate, which is the end result of the certification, right? So at the end of all ISO processes, you get a certificate, and that certificate shows that you have robust practices in place against that standard. In the case of 42001, the intent of that is going to be to get your 42001 certification to show you have good artificial intelligence management system policies and procedures in place. What that does from a business point of view is it helps facilitate additional business, right? So you want to bring in a new customer, or you want to get more vendors, et cetera, or partner with more people. Well, this certification can be used and sent to them to say, hey, I'm following a baseline standard that's provided by ISO. And ISO is internationally recognized, right? So if you're in the US or India, it doesn't really matter. It's recognized. So you can attract various different clients from various different global aspects. So that's the beauty of ISO, right? Now, let's talk a little bit specifically about what is ISO 42001, right? So ISO 42001 specifically was first published in December 18th, 2023. So it's relatively new. The purpose of ISO 42001 is its intent is to create an artificial intelligence management system, AIMS, AIMS for short. You'll hear that used commonly. So with the AIMS, the purpose of ISO 42001 AIMS system is it's going to be used to help develop, design, and create your artificial intelligence systems, right? So nowadays, every company is using AI to a certain extent. Whether you're using tools like ChatGPT that are created by a third party, or you're going to be creating your own AI systems, right, to automate certain tasks or to provide to your customers. Well, regardless of whether you're using tools or you're creating your AI tools, the AIMS system should be used, and AIMS process should be used by your organization to implement robust practices. So it applies to both users, but also creators of AI systems. One thing to kind of note is ISO tends to create all of their standards to integrate well with other frameworks, right? So if you are familiar with ISO 27001 or 701 for privacy, they've structured it and managed it in a similar way. So you're able to integrate really effortlessly between the two standards or the multiple standards. So who does ISO 42001 apply for, and how does it apply, right? Well, to give you a holistic view, artificial intelligence is company agnostic, right? Like every company is using artificial intelligence in some shape or form. It could be a healthcare company, a fintech company, or a manufacturing company. So in that regard, any company, regardless of the size and shape, should and comply with 42001 if they want to, right? So 42001 is not mandatory. It is an optional standard, but if you're using AI, it helps applies for any shape and size of the company. From an industry point of view, as I mentioned, it could be used for any sector, right? There's no sector that can be scoped out. As long as you're having or using artificial intelligence systems, you can use and comply with 42001. Some of the things to consider from the standards point of view is your organizational size, right? For organizations that are bigger versus the smaller organizations, the requirements for 42001 are the same, but the way they are applied to each organization will be different. So control in one organization might look similar or different from a control in a big organization. And the reason for that is ISO creates these standards to be applicable for any size and shape of a company, but then when you apply them, you have to apply them using your risk method and your organization's processes. And then, as I mentioned, from an industry sector point of view, the same thing. All of the controls are going to be the same, but regardless of what industry you're in, there's going to be variations in how those controls are applied. So those are the things to kind of keep in mind, that ISO 42001 is really flexible, right? The controls and requirements are what they are, but the applicability and how they're going to apply to your organization is really going to be based off of what your business cases are and use cases are within your organization. It could be applicable for public and private companies. And then the scope, right? When we're talking about the scope, that's really going to be the most important thing. As you create your AIM system, what is the scope of it? What are you going to cover in your scope? Similar to other ISO frameworks that you've seen, you're going to have to define your scope and the boundaries and then certify against those. So let's do another poll question. Does your organization plan to integrate 42001 standard with other existing ones, or get it independently? The poll question should be popping up on your screen.
Last call for responses, and I'll end the poll and share results.
Awesome. Awesome. So it seems like the vast majority of the people are not sure about integrating 42001 with other standards. Well, we'll kind of dive into some of those key aspects of 42001, and then you'll be able to see some of the correlations and differences between the two. And then based on that, for those of you that have existing certifications or planning to migrate or integrate other certifications, you would be able to see if that's possible or not. So we'll dive into some of those intricacies in a little bit. All right, so talking about the structure of ISO 42001. The structure of ISO 42001 starts off with your management clauses. These are your core mandatory requirements, right? So if you're familiar with any other ISO framework, they all have the management clauses like 27001 and et cetera. These clauses are going to be mandatory for every company to comply with, right? There's no bypassing these mandatory requirements from 42001. Then you have your Annex A. These are your technical control objectives and the actual controls related to artificial intelligence. So these are going to be applicable to a company based on their risk profile and their processes, right? So ISO comes up with a list of the controls. The organizations are going to have to evaluate against those controls and say, hey, does this apply to my organization and the processes that I'm doing? If so, you would have to comply with it. If not, you would have to justify why it doesn't apply to your organization. But Annex A is really going to be the technical controls that an organization will have to implement based on its risk profile and risk assessment. Annex B is your guidance, right? So ISO is notorious for just providing controls that are vague. So a lot of people are like asking questions, what does this mean? What does it entail? Well, Annex B is where they provide guidance. So you would say, hey, this is the control. Here's how we recommend you guys implement this control or guide you on implementing this control, right? One thing to consider here is it's not one size fits all, right? The guidance are just structures for what to consider, and then you have to tailor that for your organization. So that if you think about it from ISO 27001 comparison, the structure is really similar. ISO 27001 has your core clauses, 42001 has your core clauses. It has its Annex A that are the requirements. It has its Annex A. The only difference is for 42001, the Annex B provides that additional guidance, which in ISO 27001 is a separate standard in and of itself. So all of this is pretty baseline with the other standards that you guys are probably used to. So it makes it easier for your organizations to integrate with it, right? So hypothetically, if you wanted to do 27001 and 42001, you can do one system for artificial intelligence and information security together. There's Annex C, which is more informative in nature. These are really just potential AI-related objectives and some of the risk sources. And there's Annex D, which is the use of AIMS across your various domains and sectors. So keep in mind that Annex C and D of the standards for 42001 are just informative. There's no action items needed from the organization. They're mostly there for you guys to just read through. Annex A and B and then clauses are really going to be the meat of the actual standards themselves. Now let's dive a little bit into the actual clauses themselves, right? So if we're looking at the management clauses, the first four of them are: 4, context of the organization; 5, leadership; 6, planning; 7, support. All of these clauses are talking about having an artificial intelligence management system in place and then understanding your scope, right? So you're going to have to define the scopes and boundaries of your artificial intelligence systems. Once you've kind of identified the scope of those systems, you're going to have to identify all of your use cases around artificial intelligence, right? If you're developing it, are you using it? Then what are the use cases for it? After you've identified the tools and technologies you're using, you're going to need to say, hey, which are the stakeholders internally and externally that are impacted by your artificial intelligence technology? As you identify your stakeholders, think of the things that they're asking questions about, right? Do they care about you having security in place? Do they care about the functionality of your product, et cetera? What are some of the issues and functionalities that they care about? So you would really need to gain an understanding of not only your scope, but all of the tools and technologies you're using, and then how they impact your stakeholders. Once you've kind of gotten a great understanding of this, then you would need to make sure you have proper leadership assigned to be responsible for the aims within your organization, right? There should be a dedicated person that's responsible for creation and management of the AIM system. The AIM system will need to be reviewed and updated on a regular basis. So similar to like information security, you typically have like an information security officer in the organization. Well, this will probably mandate a new role for artificial intelligence, or combining that role with existing roles, right? So from a leadership point of view, think about who within the organization will be overseeing all of the artificial intelligence capabilities for the AIM system. And then you have to plan and support all of it, right? As you develop and use all of these artificial intelligence technology, you're going to need to train the new hires. You need to train them on a continuous basis on what are some of the risks, what are some of the functionalities, what are some of the use cases for artificial intelligence. So you're going to need to continuously train them. Then you're going to need to continuously have resources, right? Whether it's tools or people to support that. So those are some of the things that from a management clauses point of view, you're going to have to say, hey, do we have the right resources and the tools applicable to manage our artificial intelligence system now and in the near future, right? Continuing on with the clauses, there's the operational piece, there's the performance evaluations, and the improvements, right? What similar to other ISO standards, you're going to have to conduct a risk assessment, right? So previously organizations are doing risk assessment from a cybersecurity and a privacy point of view. Well, now you're going to have to do an artificial intelligence risk assessment, right? NIST came out with the framework, the NIST CSF, for risk management against AI. So you would need to look at that. As you create these risk assessments, you're going to identify various different risks and threats to your organization. Well, as you are working to mitigate those risks, you're going to need to evaluate the performance, right? So you identify this risk, you're working to fix it. Well, what are your methods to perform and make sure that you're actually remediating them? There's going to be various performance evaluations you're going to have to do. Like, here's my objective for this year. Here's my objective for the next 2 years. Here's my objective for the next 3 years. How am I going to get my risk profile from a high to a low or to a medium? Whatever your goals are, you're going to need to evaluate how you're doing from year to year, day to day. And then you're going to need to continuously improve on that, right? ISO has always been about continuous improvement. So you're going to need to come up with a plan of action of how do you progress year to year, day to day to improve your artificial intelligence management system, right? So these are all some of the core concepts that organizations will need to consider. Some of the core components and policies and documents that organizations will need to implement with the clauses is your artificial intelligence management system, your AIMS, right? As I mentioned, your AIMS system is really going to be the meat of your documentation, right? It's going to outline your scope that we talked about. What is the scopes of tools and technologies? Then it's going to say, what is your objective, right? What is your objective with implementing the tools and technologies? Then it's going to outline all of the details of like, how are you going to meet those objectives? What type of conformity internal audits and assessments are you going to have to do? How are you going to assign the appropriate roles and responsibilities? How are you going to hire all of the resources that are necessary? So your AIMS policies and procedures are really going to be the core governance that drives everything within your organization. After that, you're going to need to perform the risk assessment that I talked about, right? Similar to the existing risk assessment, you're going to have to identify your inherent risk. Then you're going to have to identify your current mitigating controls. And then you want to identify your residual controls, right? What is your risk profile now, and what is the end goal? And then what are you comfortable with? So you're going to need to do the risk assessments on at least an annual basis, if not more often. The AI technology is changing so rapidly that nowadays you might be doing a risk assessment on a continuous basis, right? Because you're adding new tools and technologies, et cetera. You're also going to need to do an impact assessment, right? So organizations currently do a business impact assessment or a privacy impact assessment. Well, now organizations will need to start doing an AI impact assessment, right? If you're using the AI tool and then something were to happen to it, how does that impact your business and how does it impact your customers? If you're using an AI tool that impacts some government entity or something like that, what are the issues or the results of that, right? So your impact assessment will need to be done on at least an annual basis as well. You'll need to go through the exercises similar to like what is the likelihood of an impact occurring. Then if it does occur, then what is the actual impact of it going to be? And finally, we're going to be talking about data protection and AI security, right? There's going to be a bunch of items that come from not just a security point of view, but a privacy point of view, right? As organizations use other AI tools and technologies, data is being shared. How are you going to protect that data being shared? How are you going to make sure the privacy is protected, right? Especially if you're an organization in Europe, like GDPR, right? And Europe just came out with the new EU AI Act. Like, how is that going to impact it? So there's going to be a lot of scrutiny around what are some of the controls from a privacy and a security point of view that you're going to implement against your AI systems. Let's do a poll. Has your organization already started developing any of your AI policies or started risk assessments or any of those core components, things that we've talked about?
I'll give you a few more minutes here, seconds here to answer. This is an interesting question, Bhavin, because this is independent of ISO policies, right? This is just generally in your organization.
Yeah, exactly, right? Yep.
I'm curious to see where everyone ends up. Your last call for responses here.
Awesome. Well, it looks like we have a pretty good split. 43% for yes, 43% for no, and 14% for I don't know. That's good. It seems like your organizations are already starting to work on risk assessments and policies, right? That's a pretty good number to have right there. We'll kind of dive into like what does your policies or risk assessment processes need to look like in a little bit later, but it's really good to know that organizations are already starting to implement some of these things. So that was not what I was expecting, so great to hear. Awesome. So now let's talk about the annexes, right? So we talked about the management clauses, which are your core mandatory requirements. Remember, the annexes are those technical controls that organizations can implement based on their risk profile, right? So diving a little bit into the annex themselves, there's broken down into various domains. So for example, the first three domains you see on your screen are A2, policies related to AI, A3, internal organizations, A4, resources of AI system. These domains will have sub-controls within them, and those are the controls that organizations will need to implement. We're not going to do a control by control analysis in this webinar, but what we are going to do is talk about the domains and what the expectations are at a high level for the domains. So talking about like the one you're seeing on your screen for policies related to AI, well, as I mentioned earlier in the poll questions, you should be creating an AI policy. The same way you have your information security policy, there should be a separate AI policy. In that AI policy, you need to consider the use cases of AI within your organization. Are you using tools like ChatGPT, et cetera? Are you developing tools? Or are you taking existingly developed tools, and then building on top of it, fine-tuning it, right? So based off of your use cases, you would need to kind of come up with a plan of action, like what is considered acceptable use cases, right? So if you're allowing the use of ChatGPT, your AI policy needs to say, hey, we allow it, but don't put any sensitive data on it, only put public data. Or vice versa, if you're developing a system and training it up, you should only be using public data or fake generated data. You shouldn't be using sensitive customer data, right? So your AI policy will need to outline all of those different things on the use cases of AI technology, but also the types of data that can be used in those AI technologies. The other thing you should consider as part of your AI policy is like who's going to be responsible for the security of it, right? So I mentioned earlier, and that kind of goes well with internal organization roles and responsibility. You will need to have someone in your organization as your AI officer, right? They're the ones that are going to need to create your policies and procedures and keep all these updated, right? As AI regulations come out, as AI changes, you're going to need to continuously update that. So identifying that current stakeholder who's going to be responsible for AI is going to be really critical. And then them communicating to everyone else in the organization, right? Earlier I mentioned that AI is used in any type of shape and form. What every department, it doesn't matter if you're in sales or marketing or finance, is going to be using AI or impacted by AI. Well, now you need to train all users on the AI capabilities based on your policies, right? So your AI policy will need to outline what are my plans to train employees on it? What are my plans to communicate items to them, right? What are my plans to make sure I'm keeping them aware of what's going on? So it's going to be really important from a communication point of view, like what are those communication channels? What are the methods and how often are you going to be doing those? The other aspects we'll dive into for the Annex A controls are A5, assessing the impact of AI systems, right? A6, AI system lifecycle. A7, data for AI systems. These are all really related to talking about, okay, doing an impact assessment that we talked about earlier, right? Does the organization do an impact assessment for artificial intelligence? You're going to need to send out surveys and meet with your individual stakeholders and teams. Say, hey, what are you guys doing currently for AI within your organization? How are you using it? What tools are you using? You're going to need to collect all of these different data sources. Then as you collect it, then you're going to have to say, what are some of the risk profiles as it impacts to your specific department or your specific use cases? And then once all of that data is collected, you would need to consolidate all of that and say, hey, based off of our use cases and every single department that we've conducted surveys or interviews for, here's our risk profile and here's our impact if anything's were to happen to our organization, right? So similar to how organizations are doing a risk assessment and impact assessment for privacy, the AI impact assessment will feed across all departments and all organizations, right? Then you're going to have to create a life cycle for developing your AI products, right? So a lot of entities nowadays are not just using AI tools, they're developing AI tools, right? So you go to Hugging Face and you create one of their models and then you build on top of it, or you're creating your own model internally. Well, as developers develop this new technology, what they're doing is they're ingesting vast amounts of data, then they're testing that data and training that data set to give you a specific output. Now, if you're feeding the data wrong information, then the outputs are always going to be wrong, right? And so essentially the developers need to come up with the process to say, hey, what are our methods to make sure the data we're collecting is accurate and usable? Then two, how are we training our models to make sure we're getting the right results that we want? And then three, how are we validating and testing according to that, right? There's going to be a whole update to your software development lifecycle processes on like how the data will be ingested, what type of testing is needed on that data to train a model, and then what are the additional verification steps that are going to be needed, right? And that kind of ties closely with A7 data, right? Like when you're training these data, are you collecting the data internally and keeping it internally only? Or are you collecting it from an external source, right? Like, are you getting it from a OpenAI and then integrating internally? Or are you getting it from another customer? It becomes really important to know where your data is coming from, right? So having some type of data flow diagrams and mappings, those are going to be super useful because you will know where the data is coming from. But then after that, you're going to need to know what type of data is it, right? Like, is it sensitive or not, right? So all of those different things are going to tie back to having a secure software development process. From a testing point of view, you're going to have to consider various things too, right? Like not just developing the product initially, but you're going to have to do like security testing, right? Right now, developers do like static code analysis and dynamic code analysis. Well, similar methods are going to have to be done for these new AI models that organizations are training, right? OWASP released their top 20 for artificial intelligence, right? It talks about hallucination, poisoning, injection attacks, all of these different new like attack vectors that hackers can use to collect and get access to your sensitive data. The software development lifecycle process and your data management process should consider all of that. The next set of domains are talking about information for interested parties, the use of artificial intelligence systems, and then third-party and customer relationships, right? So as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the times organizations are partnering together, right? So there's data being sent from point A to point B between organizations. Well, as the adoption of AI continues, especially considering like, open AI tools and all of these other items that are publicly available, well, you need to fully understand where your data is coming from and where it's going, right? And so from there, you need to say, hey, who has the right ownership of it? There's a big legal aspect to the AI data, right? Now, if you're developing the data and you're training on it, is that data yours? But then if you collect the data from like an open API or something like that, and then you build on top of it, is it theirs, right? There's going to be a lot of legal aspects to it that the organizations will need to consider. So the legal teams will need to be involved. Then as the legal team gets involved, contracts needs to be updated, all of the due diligence needs to be done, et cetera, right? So there's going to be a vast amount of third-party due diligence and considerations that the organizations will have to do, like from the data exercises, right? So that data mapping and the data flow diagram helps you identify where the data are. But then from there, if you're sending and working with third parties, there's going to be a lot of IP related stuff, intellectual property or copyright related stuff, and contractual things for organizations to consider. All right. We'll take a pause here. I know I kind of threw a lot. There's a poll question. Does your organization plan to implement 42001 in the next year or two? Take a few moments to answer the question.
We have a couple seconds here for any final respondents.
Awesome. Looks like the results are in. So it seems like most organizations aren't sure yet, right, if they're planning to implement it or not. Hopefully at the end of this webinar, the conversations will start, and then the organizations will have more information as to like what is the benefits and use cases of artificial intelligence 42001 standard, and then whether you should implement it or not. But it's good to know that the organizations are thinking about it at least. All right. As I mentioned earlier, 42001 is not a mandatory standard, but as other standards have seen, as these standards come out, organizations, laws, regulations will come out that will eventually mandate something that impacts the standard, right? So for example, NIST came out with their risk management framework, right? The Biden administration issued an executive order last year. And then recently, the European Union created the AI Act, right? So the European Union's AI Act was the first law related to AI, right? Which is a big thing. As anytime you see in one like entity or one country creates a law or regulation, the other ones are going to follow, right? So the European Act specifically, if we're going to talk about that one, they're mandating a lot of different things if you're creating AI systems. One of the things, for example, is like, hey, if you're developing an AI system and it's rated high or critical in terms of a tier impact, well, you need to report all of your testing capabilities to the government, right? So for example, if you're developing an AI system, driverless car that could potentially impact humans or someone else, and you're classified as a tier high, well, now if you have to take all of the testing that we talked about from your software development piece and then send that to the government so they can look and validate all of the testing requirements. That's a big impact, right? Like now, not only are you doing testing yourself, but you need to be sharing all of this data with other organizations. So it's going to be really important to monitor all of these new regulations that come out, right? the European Act specifically, the Biden executive order, the NIST frameworks, all of these, if you read them and go through them, they talk about having some type of like management framework in place to manage your AI systems. Well, ISO 42001 is not mandatory, but it has a framework for you to implement your management systems in place, right? So it ties really well with all of these regulations and laws that will eventually come, right? So if you look at the European Act, it talks about having to do a risk assessment and an impact assessment. And as we already mentioned, 42001 already has that covered. So if an organization gets 42001 certified, they're already well on their way to complying with some of these regulations that are out there by these countries. And then as new ones come and develop, it will be additional things that they're going to mandate. Well, 42001 will be your baseline fundamental. And then if there's any deltas, you would just add in those things, right? So even though 42001 is not mandatory by any means, having that will set you up for compliance with a lot of new laws and regulations that are going to be coming out in the near future. Now let's talk a little bit about achieving compliance with ISO 42001, right? So in order for you to start your process for 42001, we typically recommend doing a gap assessment and a readiness assessment. So you need to currently identify what your current environment, right? And then what is the to-be state of the environment to comply with 42001. So our gap assessments and readiness assessments will come in and say, hey, here's your policies and procedures, here's where the gaps are, and then here's what you need to do to address those gaps. And then as you address them, the next step of that is going to be fixing those gaps, right? Where you kind of need to do consulting and preparation services. So organizations will need to fix every single one of those gaps and say, hey, are we ready for the 42001 certification process or not? Once the gaps are remediated, that's when you can start the actual process for certification. These first two processes really where you're trying to identify your current scope of your environment and figure out where you are. After you do the consulting prep and get all of that ready and you decide to pursue 42001, you need to do your risk assessment, which is mandatory, right? We've already kind of talked about that, but that needs to be done as before any of your certification audits. You also need to do your internal audit, right? With a vendor like Tevora that has appropriate skills and technologies. Similar to 27001, you need to have someone that has the skills and certifications like a 27001 lead auditor. There's a 42001 lead auditor certification. So anytime you're getting an internal audit done, you need to make sure that they are capable and competent to do that based on their certifications. Then you will get your external audit certification itself, right? So this will be through a vendor like BSI or any other ones, whatever entity you choose. They're the ones that are going to do the actual certification issuance. So they'll assess the internal audit's work, and then they're going to ask a few additional questions and then certify you against 42001. And then you're going to get issued finally the certificate, right? So this is a long process to be 42001 certified right now, right? One of the things to kind of note in here is 42001 certification can be obtained independently. You don't have to get it with 27001 or any other ones, but you can combine it with those, right? So if you already have 27001 and you want to add 42001, you can combine them together. Now let's talk about timing, right? That whole process I showed you is a long process. So how long would it take an organization to start to finish that whole process, right? That process can take anywhere between 3 to 12 months for an organization to start the gap assessment to all the way being certified externally, right? But one of the things to kind of note here is from a certification point of view, BSI and all of these external certification bodies cannot issue ISO 42001 certifications right now. BSI and all of these other certifications are going through the process to be accredited, right? Once they're accredited against the 42001 certification, they are able to issue that certificate to entities, right? And so that process they're going through right now should be done by Q3 or Q4 of this year. So by the end of this year, these organizations like BSI and other certification bodies will be able to issue certificates against 42001. So what does that mean for organizations like yourselves? Well, what that means is you can't get certified right now, but you can start the process, right? So it's a 3 to 12 month time period to be certified. If you start the gap assessment now, and then you start creating the risk assessments and the policies, then by the end of this year, you should have all of those items in place. And then when BSI and the external certification bodies are ready to issue certificates, all you have to do is just do the external audit at that point, right? You can do all of the remediation and the consulting and the internal audits and have all of that prep ready to go. And then when the external certification bodies are ready, go through that exercise, and then you would be one of the first few to have the certification. That would be a unique selling proposition to your customers and vendors and partners, right? One of the first ones to get the 42001 certification. So think about the timing in the sense that, hey, you should probably start your journey now so that if you do want to pursue 42001 later in the year, then you have that capability to do it. And then this slide just reiterates the same thing. You cannot be issued a certification right now because BSI and the external certification bodies are going through their process. But once you're done with that in Q3 or Q4, then it's all going to follow the same standard processes as any other certification. That's the end of the webinar. We'll pause here for some Q&A sessions. So if you guys have any questions, I'll populate the Zoom chat and we'll answer those at this time. All right. So one of the questions mentions, how does ISO 42001 relate to under management systems, right? So as I mentioned earlier, 42001 is an independent certification right now, but it's structured really similarly to be compatible with 27701, which is your information security one, and then 27701, which is your privacy one, right? When we're talking about security and artificial intelligence, you can't talk about artificial intelligence without security and privacy, right? All of these certifications are going to be really similar in terms of some of the concepts that you're going to have to follow. But from a talking and from a client point of view, you're also going to be using the same terminologies, right? There's pieces of artificial intelligence that touch on privacy. There's pieces that touch on security. Well, it makes it really useful for organizations to have 42001, 27701 for privacy, and then 01 for security. Because now if you have all three certifications, you've not only answered all of your questions related to privacy, security, and artificial intelligence all in one, right? So that's the benefit of it. Looks like we have another question that came in. What are the challenges typically faced during the implementation of 42001 and how can they be overcome? Good question. So some of the challenges that are occurring right now is obviously understanding the use cases of AI, right? Like a lot of organizations these days don't really know where their AI tools are being used and then how they're being used. So earlier I talked about doing an impact assessment and risk assessment. Organizations really need to sit down with every single department and say, hey, what are you using the AI systems for? How are you using it? Because it differs from one user to another user, right? And then as you identify that, then being able to come up with a collective solution to say, hey, this is how we want all of our users to be able to use our AI system is going to be a challenge, right? Like if you think about ChatGPT as an example, every user uses ChatGPT differently. Some people know not to put sensitive data in there, others don't, right? So it's going to be a learning curve. So collecting all of the data points of like what tools you're using, how you're using them, and then training the users is really going to be the biggest challenge because there's going to be a big learning curve. Artificial intelligence systems are going to impact technical roles, but also non-technical roles, right? From an HR point of view, from a legal point of view, et cetera. So every organization and department will need to consider that. So that's the biggest challenge right now. It's where are your systems? What are the use cases of your systems? And then how are those going to be implemented and followed by each of the users? Another question we got, what are those three again? So essentially, the question related to that one is, what are some of the challenges, right? So the challenges we were talking about is having a good list of inventory of your system, right? So think about it, you need to sit down with your stakeholders and department to identify what are the systems and tools you're currently using. The second piece of that is how are you using those tools and technologies? Right? You need to understand what are the use cases and how you're using them. Then the third piece of it is what type of data are you using and are the users protecting that data, right? That's the biggest challenge. It's kind of like collecting the whole inventory of all of the tools and technologies you're using against the process. All right. One of the questions that came in is, can you provide an example of an organization that has successfully implemented ISO 42001? Well, no organization has successfully implemented it now. This standard was just released, as I said, in December of 2023. Organizations are starting to implement this, right? So all organizations are currently starting this process and flow. Most of the organizations that we're seeing right now are doing the readiness assessments and the gap assessments, right? So they're starting to identify what are their policies and what are their procedures currently and what are the gaps against the standard. And then as they do this gap analysis and readiness assessment, they're able to say, okay, this is our current state. This is the future state of what we need to be in. And then slowly as the days progress, organizations will start implementing their policies and procedures and controls to meet that. And then eventually they would comply with the implementation requirements. But that's going to be a little bit of a time period. Like I said, it could be anywhere from 3 months to 12 months for the organization to comply with the 42,000. Oh, okay. Sorry, I misunderstood the question earlier. The 3 standards that I was talking about was 42,001 for artificial intelligence. The other standard that I had mentioned was 27,001, which was related to information security. And then I had also talked about the 27,701, which is your privacy standard, right? So 27,701 is privacy information security systems. The 27,001 is information systems. And then 42,001 is artificial intelligence. A lot of organizations are considering to combine all 3 of them because those answer all of your questions from a privacy, from a security, and from an artificial intelligence point of view, right? And there's a lot of concepts in each of those frameworks that build on itself, right? So if you think about artificial intelligence, it's in where's your data and how do you protect it? But then it also talks about like legal aspects from a privacy point of view. Well, if you have the privacy standard, it covers all your privacy needs. Then you have your security standard, it covers all your security needs. Then you have your 42,001 artificial intelligence, it covers all your artificial intelligence needs. Now you have a robust system for 3 standards to give to your clients and vendors. I see one other question. Would this recording be uploaded for later review? Yes. The recordings will be available for reference at a later time for sure. So it will, the marketing team and Christy and them will be referring out to each of you guys and sending out the referral.
Yeah, all our webinar recordings are actually available on our YouTube channel. And yes, if you've registered for this interview, you will receive the recording via email as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I don't see any other questions on my side. So with that, I'll go ahead and conclude the webinar. As I said, my name is Bhavin Patel. If you guys have any questions or more concerns about the standard, please feel free to reach out to me at any time. But thank you for attending the webinar, and I'm looking forward to talking to each of you guys individually.